Ladies and gentlemen, now we got another interesting video that I'm standing in front of my green screen for today. I posted Secrets of the Mimic on my channel, and I have some thoughts that I'm going to share today. Namely, as you can see in the title, how FNAF Security Breach is better than Secrets of the Mimic. Now there's probably 3 questions that are likely to be asked right now at the beginning of this video. The first one is probably, what's the new lore? I mean, I've made a lore video on this channel, so does the lore change at all? It does, and I'll explain that for certain. Second question, when's the first Gigamonty reference gonna happen? Guess what? Right now! Stop your timers, everyone. Anyways, your third and final question is probably, no, you're wrong. It's not a question, but it's probably what you're thinking. And for that, just hear me out. Just hear me out. And another important thing to point out is that, if you're wondering if this is maybe a little late in comparison to the game and into Security Breach and to all of that, you would be very right. This project was procrastinated much longer than it needed to. But anyways, it's here now, and that's what matters. So enjoy the video. And so, without further ado, let's get into the video. So in order to properly do this video, we need to set it up first. Firstly, we're going to be comparing Secrets of the Mimic in its current state with Security Breach in its current state. We are comparing it to the Security Breach after the many bug fixes and patches that have improved the game. Also, we will not be including Ruin, as that is pretty much a separate game. Even though it's a DLC, it's pretty much a separate game. Now I'm going to split this video up into explaining 5 different categories. The 5 categories that make up game design. From the least to most important, we have graphics, sound, story, characters, and above all, gameplay. These will be compared and contrasted in detail. So let's first begin with graphics. Looking at Security Breach, the graphics are pretty good. However, if you all remember when Security Breach came out, it was terribly unoptimized, and you would need a NASA supercomputer to run it on anything above medium. However, since then they've released multiple optimization updates, and it now, for the most part, runs without lag issues, even on higher settings. And the game itself does look beautiful. The amount of detail that went into it, the sheer amount of places to explore, and how they contrast with each other really creates an immersive and interesting environment to explore in the game. Now to the Mimic. You see, Secrets of the Mimic is set up very differently. If you look around, you see all these different characters and things, and the whole game just feels fundamentally different from what Security Breach felt like. The graphics don't necessarily look horrible, but they don't look like graphics you'd typically see in a Five Nights at Freddy's game. The graphics in this game are more akin to a game like My Friendly Neighborhood or Hello Neighbor. Other than that, there's not too much to linger on as far as graphics is concerned, so we're moving on to sound design. Something that is definitely more a part of the Five Nights at Freddy's games. Now, graphics, you don't really need good graphics to make a good game. That's why it's at the bottom of the list. Sound design, however, is a little bit more important. Granted, you don't even need sound to make a good game, but it certainly can help with setting the mood. Now, in Security Breach, it's got all your typical Five Nights at Freddy's jump scare sounds, and atmospheric noise, and even some really banger music, I must say. And it does do a good job of giving you that Five Nights at Freddy's feel. There's the ambient sounds of music, arcade games in the arcade, and not to mention the animatronics sounds. They sound mechanic, you can hear all the parts moving, And you can also hear the very loud thudding of footsteps as they are pursuing right behind you. There's not too much to write home about. Typically, games tend to get sound design properly. There are a few exceptions, but it is typically something that can be done well. So, Security Breach does good in the sound department. However, Secrets of the Mimic, I must say that it does have better atmosphere. The fact that you can explore the building freely means that there are a number of atmospheric sounds you can happen to run into outside of scripted events.
Daddy's busy, buddy. Why don't we go outside and play?
Occasional creakings, sounds of animatronics moving around and talking to you really create a terrifying atmosphere and makes you feel like you're in this building that's foreign to you, that's old and run down, and that nowhere is truly safe. Not to mention, I will have to say that the music in certain parts is honestly great. Like in Dolly's Chase, that music is genuinely epic, and you're probably hearing it in the video right now. So I would say that Secrets of the Mimic does a better job at sound design than Security Breach. So at least it has that going for it. Now, there wasn't a lot to talk about in graphics and sound design because those are typically two parts of games that you don't really need to make a good game. This next part is far more important, however, and that is having a good story. Without a good story, the game would need to rely on its gameplay and characters. Some of my favorite games do include story games. Ignore Security Breach. Listen, man, I love it for its bugs. The story in Security Breach is, albeit a bit lackluster. Fans were really hoping to see more expounded on lore and answers to questions they had, in addition to seeing more than, 15 minutes from the game's alleged main villain, Vanny. She kinda just shows up on occasion and scares you a little bit, but that's getting more into our character talk. The game doesn't really focus on the primary lore elements. It more just kind of exists. It's got some lore drops, sure, but nothing that really is super impactful. The story, if people really know some history behind the game, was probably meant to be very different, because looking at old trailers for the game, you can hear characters and voice lines never heard in the actual game. And also see scenes that were never actually in the game. And it makes you wonder what all was changed and what all was thrown out. Now the story for Security Breach is basically as follows. Gregory is trapped in this pizzaplex and needs to escape, but he is being hunted by the security guard / murderous rabbit lady Vanny, and he can find William Afton buried in the basement if you do go down that ending. But, this was William Afton's 80,000th time coming back in the FNAF lore, so it was kind of repetitive and boring. I am glad that Scott Cawthon has since decided to remove Mr. Afton, as seen in Help Wanted 2, with more of a focus on Vanny. Now, as for the lore of Security Breach, again, not super impactful to the overall FNAF lore. It doesn't really give you questions or answers, honestly. It's really just kind of lacking in that section. And it is one of the key things that shows that the game was kind of rushed out the door. A lesson to Scott Cawthon and Steel Wool about communicating with each other more properly and having to coordinate a bit better. But I would say they made up with it in Ruin and Help Wanted 2, creating actually good lore. But that's not what we're comparing today. Secrets of the Mimic, on the other hand, I find to be a far worse perpetrator. Because better have a game that doesn't contribute to the lore very much at all than have a game that retcons it entirely. Now, what am I talking about here? I am, of course, referring to the fact that the entirety of Secrets of the Mimic is a giant retcon. For those of you more experienced FNAFers out there, you would know that the Mimic did not originate in Ruin, but actually came from a series of books called Five Nights at Freddy's Tales from the Pizzaplex. He appeared near the end of the books as kind of a character, sections, these little epilogues at the end of the books that are chasing a bunch of teens that got trapped underneath the under construction Pizzaplex. There is also a story in these books that explains, very clearly might I add, the Mimic's upbringing and overall story. In the books, the Mimic goes as follows. You see, Edmund Murray is an inventor who, after graduating, created a little vacuum appliance that was kind of like an early version of a Roomba. He did this so that he could have enough money to get himself a place to allow him to continue his inventing. Now, he met and married Fiona, and they bought this factory together. It was old and abandoned, but they bought it together in the hopes of improving his inventing business. He took a couple freelance jobs, but he was really just working alone, so all of those took time. And then one day, Fiona got pregnant, and eventually, she died giving birth to Edwin's son, David. Now, Edwin was very upset at the loss of his wife, but he needed to continue inventing things and doing freelance jobs, primarily for organizations like Fazbear Entertainment with creating animatronics and whatnot, in order to keep the roof over his and his son's heads and keep food on the table. Now, David was an adventurous little child, as most children are, and while Edwin tried his best to be there for his son, he was working by himself, so he needed to invent things, and he needed to work on his projects. And so he did his best to be there for his son, taking him out to his favorite ice cream places and whatnot, but he needed someone to look after his son. And that's when he catched a brilliant idea: to create a robot to mimic his son David's movements so that he could have someone to play with. And so that's what he got to work on: the Mimic. And his son and the Mimic played together, and he finally had someone to keep David occupied while he worked. And then he thought it would be a brilliant idea to also use the Mimic as new programming for some of the animatronics he's working on for Fazbear. That's exactly what he started doing. However, this Mimic was not in fact trained to guard his son from danger or watch over him like a parent would, just to mimic his actions. And so, David, after kicking his ball out into the street, ran out to go and get it, and got run over by a truck. Edwin was absolutely destroyed by this news. But he still needed to work on his creations, but he found it very difficult to do so because the Mimic was still around, mimicking his son. And so, he got very mad at it and beat the crap out of it with a lead pipe. And then he left his factory and went to work for a job at Fazbear Entertainment, which is explained in a different story which doesn't really apply to here. The Mimic then was left alone in the factory, and Fazbear Entertainment obviously sent some of their guys out to go repo some of the stuff that Edwin owned them. And these guys got killed by the Mimic because now the Mimic is mimicking violent behavior, and so therefore is trying to beat up all the people who come and get it, because that's how it was trained. But then one day, Fazbear Entertainment does manage to get it. I don't know exactly what they did. Maybe they sent in a freaking SEAL team. I don't really know. But one day, the Mimic was brought in, and it was taken to the new construction of the Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex. And this is, of course, the place where the old Pizzeria Simulator location was, and they were just building over the top of it. And they were planning to turn the old Pizzeria Simulator place into kind of a museum of Fazbear past. And all of a sudden, this shipment came in of endoskeleton parts, including the Mimic. Now, in this old pizzeria, there were a lot of endoskeleton parts and robotic parts and whatnot. And so this one construction worker got the brilliant idea of, hey, you know this animatronic? It's already got some code here. I'm a good coder. I'll just code it to remove the arms and legs of all these endoskeleton parts to make our job easier. And so he did that. The Mimic woke up, and look at that. It's removing all the arms and legs from all the different endoskeletons. But then, guess what? it wasn't programmed properly. So now it's just removing all the arms and legs from everything it sees. So it starts turning towards the construction workers and removing their arms and legs. And then before you know it, everyone's trying to run out, and then they seal it underground with concrete. And that's kind of how the Mimic ended up under the Pizzaplex in Security Breach. And so that's the lore of the Mimic. It makes sense, right? It all flows together. And there's no questions you have afterwards, because it's all explained about what happens in the Mimic in Ruin. Right? Wrong. Because in Secrets of the Mimic, there is a very different plotline being told, and they completely retconned all of that. You see, in Secrets of the Mimic, the lore goes as follows. Edwin was working at his father's factory, and then he met his wife, who was also working there, and they married, and then one day his dad died, and he inherited the factory. Already sounding a little different, is it not? Well, Edwin rebranded the factory under his own name, and eventually Fiona gave birth to their son. Strangely enough, she didn't die this time. Interesting. Edwin was actually a pretty lousy father. He didn't hang out with his son that much, and just secluded himself to his office to work on his inventions and prioritize that more than family. Also interesting. Can you spot the difference yet? Anyways, one day Fiona died in a tragic accident relating to some fall festival they had going on. Now, Edwin was very distraught by this, but he came up with the brilliant idea of creating someone or something that could mimic his wife. So he worked on M1, the first iteration of the Mimic, to mimic his wife, and so he did that. And therefore he had a robot wife, which he loved. However, again, she wasn't exactly great at looking after children, and David kicked his ball in the street and got run over by a truck. And so then he decided to create M2 to replace his son, but M2 didn't quite work out properly. Edwin was like, man, I can't work on this anymore. These aren't my family, these are just robots. And so he beat the crap out of M2. And then M2 started beating the crap out of a bunch of employees, which Edwin also curiously didn't have in the books, but you know what, I guess we'll get to that later. Anyways, M1, Edwin's wife, wanted David back, wanted her robot son to live in robot harmony, but Edwin said no. He locked himself in his house, but then one day, the Mimic came for him and ended up killing him. In this area where you find out what actually happened to Edwin, you kind of feel that the Mimic is petty here, saying things like,
"Call for help! Daddy's busy, buddy. Why don't you go outside and play?"
to Edwin while he's down on the ground, injured. But this paints the wrong idea of the Mimic. The Mimic isn't petty, it's just mimicking the things it has seen. But anyways, that's getting besides the point. Anyways, the Mimic escapes, goes on a killing spree, and wants to try and fix itself, presumably. I don't know. Things get confusing at this point because now nothing makes sense. Anyways, Edwin's killed by the Mimic. The M1 turns into Mexus, I guess, and then wants M2 to get fixed, and that's what Arnold is supposed to do. Now we're left with two Mimics walking around doing their own things, a whole lot of questions, not a lot of answers, and a giant big fat retcon. And also with the knowledge that apparently the Mimic is supposed to be this integral part of the FNAF lore because Edwin was working with Fazbear Entertainment. Yet, for some reason, despite being so integral to the overall lore, the Mimic was never once mentioned, even in a little bit. Until now. Until Ruin. Until Tales of the Pizzaplex. Throughout all the games before. Never once mentioned. Until now, I guess. That's cool. Yeah, that makes sense. This is a different thing from just retconning. I mean, yeah, the game definitely retconned a whole lot that would have made the Mimic, make sense, but why would we have that? This is FNAF. Nothing's supposed to make sense. And left us with more questions than answers, but it's also doing another thing that I call character conning, or care conning, whatever you want to call it. It's when a show, or a game, or whatever, really far down the franchise decides that, hey, let's add this character or other MacGuffin to the series that was allegedly important the whole time, yet was never once mentioned at all, even hinted at in the slightest. Just all of a sudden, now it's this really important thing. You know why? because then we can stretch this series out longer, because we can focus on a new thing. And then now we have the Mimic, which is just this new thing that nobody cares about. Why is he here? Oh, you know what? I'm not even gonna go off on that rant right now, because it's just gonna make me mad. AstralSpiff described it very well.
So this game is doing a lot of like, actually, all of these character designs existed in the Edwin Costume Factory.
Yeah, this is bad because this means that all this theorizing done by MatPat and many others for the past several years has meant literally pretty much nothing, because now Scott Cawthon's just gonna change everything. I mean, we already understand that he just makes it up as he goes along, but never quite before have we seen him just completely retcon things like this. He's just actively changing what the lore has been and should be, which is just not good at all. So yeah, that's the story of the Mimic, and yeah, I would rather have security breaches not contributing to the lore at all than have the Mimics retcon it. Retconning is the worst offense in any series ever. Anyways, now that we're done with that long talk about story, let's get on to the characters. Now, in Security Breach, you have Gregory, who, I have interesting theories on in my theory video, which you should definitely watch after this video. But, you know, people have theorized who Gregory is, but in the game, he's portrayed as a small child who is trapped inside the Pizzaplex, but in Ruin, he's hinted to be probably someone more sinister. There's a theory going around that Gregory's a robot, but you know what? That's getting into stuff that's besides the main game. That's getting into theoretical territory. We're focusing on facts, gosh darn it. Anyways, Gregory as a character isn't too bad. He plays the role of scared child pretty well as maybe having some hidden motives. And so I find that pretty cool. I've always found it cool when in movies or whatever, a character previously portrayed as completely innocent turns out to be hiding a very dark secret. I'm all about that kind of mental trickery. It's very cool. And so I'd say Gregory's a pretty good character. He's a pretty good person to play as. Now we're looking at, you know, the four main animatronics who all have their own personalities. How does this make sense considering they're robots and they seem to have such intimate personalities? Well, it's probably because every animatronic that... Wait, no. Now, pull back. It's getting into theoretical territory again. I must resist theorizing. You know, we have Freddy. You know, he's kind of like your Fredad, as some people have called him. He's the fatherly figure who guides you through the Pizzaplex and ensures that you stay safe. You have Monty and Chica, who are just kind of grunts who pursue you. You have Roxanne Wolf, which for some reason has become incredibly important to the lore. Why? Probably because she's a furry, but you know what? That's besides the point again. I would say that the characters are pretty well set out in how they act in the game. Their AI is, albeit a bit simple and buggy. Pretty much if you've gained an elevation on any sort of surface, like jumping on a desk, they can't pathfind to you at all. So the AI is pretty dumb, and so they're pretty simple as far as characters concerned, except for Freddy, who has a mind of his own at times.
Freddy, please. Oh my god, no! Not like this. Not like this. Please. Give me in. Freddy! Freddy!
Then you have Vanessa/Vanny, the security guard who is secretly evil bunny lady who kills people. Now, she would probably be a great character and should have been what the next major FNAF game was about, because of how she was portrayed in Help Wanted 2 as being so important and taking the role of Afton. Ooh, wouldn't she be really cool to have? She'd be a really cool character, right? That's exactly why that since her inception in Security Breach throughout all the games, she's gotten about 15 whole minutes of screen time. Yeah, that's right. Despite being the main antagonist of Security Breach, she just kind of hops around in certain areas, chases you for a little bit, and then it's kind of never seen again until one of the endings where you like kill her or save her or whatever. Despite being so important to both the lore and the game, she hardly shows her face at all. So she's pretty poorly written and designed. And then you have a bunch of other characters like Music Man and all these other characters that have their unique gimmicks or whatnot. Now, unfortunately, the AI in Security Breach isn't super great, and the entire game itself is a little bit bland. But that's getting more into gameplay, which we'll talk about in a bit. All in all, the characters in Security Breach, I give a positive 6 out of 10. I don't know, there's nothing really special to write home about. There's lore implications, but that's dipping back into story. As for the characters themselves, more just pursuer enemies except for Gregory and Freddy. Those characters are the good characters. Everyone else, pretty meh. Except for Mapbot. Mapbot's cool, and also has the scariest jump scares in the entire game.
Hi, please take this map.
As for Secrets of the Mimic, well, you know, Edwin, completely retconned. Fiona, completely retconned. Well, M1 retconned into place. M2, the Mimic, misunderstood and misportrayed, I think. And also, another thing about the Mimic. An enemy that can hide in any one of the creepy suits you find around the place ready to jump at you is genuinely a really scary thought. And I find that as an excellent villain. That's an excellent horror aspect. Say something like Alien Isolation, with the alien that hunts you down. Similar to this, if you get in a chase with the Mimic or the alien, you're likely not getting out of that chase alive. Both the Mimic and the alien are substantially faster than you and have an intimidating presence. However, the Mimic has some drawbacks. The AI, pretty dumb. For instance, you can easily juke it if you get into somewhere it just simply can't pathfind to, which there's not a lot because they removed the jump button. Also, the Mimic dresses up in goofy costumes, and I would really like it that if you got somewhere its goofy costume couldn't reach or got too far away from it, it would do like in the books and just hop out of the costume and just like super fast run up the walls to get you. That would be terrifying. And then also additionally, a cooler, more terrifying way for it to hunt you, rather than in an area you go to, a random suit wakes up and just starts walking around, rather there be, say, the Mimic hiding in a suit, waiting for you to come in front of it. And maybe it can be like the alien from Alien Isolation, hiding in a vent, with the only clue that it's there being its saliva dripping down. Maybe, I don't know, around the animatronic there can be scuff marks or scratches on the ground or something to let you know that it's hiding in that suit. And then if you get close to it, it'll jump up and grab you. That would be terrifying, and also pretty cool. And if you make a loud noise in the section, maybe that's what gets the suit to wake up and go pursue. I feel like the Mimic could be an excellent horror character, but I feel like, in addition to its retcons, it's not portrayed scarily enough. It has real potential, but just doesn't have the sauce that you really want. And then you have the other enemies in the game. The other enemies in the game, albeit, do have their own cool chase segments, and those are pretty fun to be a part of, especially with, say, the Music Man's chase segment with randomization in a chase. Are you kidding me? This is unheard of. Typically, chases in video games chase you down the same path again and again until eventually you make it. Whereas in this, it actually changes up where you're supposed to go in the chase, which is epic in my opinion. However, it seems that all the enemies in the game boil down to a 1 or 2 chase sequence where they chase you through an area and then either they disappear from the game entirely or they kind of walk around menacingly in an area, which you can dodge them by just hiding in a locker or whatever. It'd be really cool. I mean, I understand they're all being controlled by the same Mimic, but it would be really cool if each of the different characters had different abilities or different ways of finding you that could add variety to the gameplay. That's my thoughts on the characters in the Mimic. A lot of them are retconned in how they behave, and so I just don't know what to think. And as for the Mimic, I find it a huge missed opportunity on something that could actually be a really scary villain. They came so close, but yet so far. And so that brings us to our final category that we will be discussing, and that is the most important part of any game, should all else fail, gameplay. You got in Security Breach. Pretty basic gameplay that consists of listen to dialogue, go to X place so X thing can happen, then go to X place to get X thing, go back to other X place, listen to more dialogue, then go somewhere else, and then listen to more dialogue, go somewhere else, dodge an animatronic maybe, blah blah blah. It's pretty much just fetch quests. Get X item to take to X place for X thing to happen. There are some neat segments, like the Monty boss fight, which I genuinely consider a boss fight and think it is actually probably the most well fleshed out part of the game. And everything else is just either annoying puzzles or lame chase sequences that are quote-unquote boss fights. So the gameplay in Security Breach is a bit lackluster. I like the open world element, being able to explore the whole pizza place, and the fact that they added a save station after 6 a.m. so that way after 6 a.m. you weren't completely screwed and you could actually go and collect all the collectibles and things. But the actual gameplay of the core of the game itself is only made interesting, in my opinion, by bugs and glitches that you can exploit to your heart's content. Want to get yourself soft locked in a hurry? You can. Want to glitch out of the map? You can. Want to warp to the other side of the map? You can. You can do a lot. And it's genuinely fun because you can play the game in all manners of ways by just abusing it and making it glitch out. But if you're playing the game the normal intended way, it's pretty boring. Now, as for Secrets of the Mimic, honestly, the gameplay, I will admit, is good. There's a unique, different amount of bosses and bad guys, and there's unique puzzles and different sections to go through, and there is an exploring aspect to the game where you can go all over the mansion whenever you want, and the collectibles and the mini games and the secrets and the endings, all of that is actually pretty well fleshed out and very good. You can tell that they did put time into it. However, I'm going to go to something that Markiplier said.
This is really well done, minus some save and some bugs here and there. I really want the gameplay to feel like I'm playing almost Tetris, you know? I like that. I like that about the originals. I look at all these tubes and I look at all the glowing goop and I look at all of the amazing art and the amount of work that's put into it. And I think it's really cool, and it is. I don't know, it just doesn't feel the same.
He made a very good point in saying that, indeed, it does not feel like a Five Nights at Freddy's game. And this is when we get to the crux of the issue, the heart of the matter. The biggest problem with Five Nights at Freddy's Secrets of the Mimic is that it doesn't feel like a Five Nights at Freddy's game. The characters, they look different. They don't look like Five Nights at Freddy's characters that we've come to know and love over the years. If Scott Cawthon's introduced a new character, he's done so in a way that's influenced with old characters as games have gone on. But now, this game just throws you into a completely foreign environment. Nothing looks like a Five Nights at Freddy's game. And I go back to what I said earlier in the video of this feeling like My Friendly Neighborhood or Poppy Playtime. Honestly, some of the similarities in gameplay with Poppy Playtime and some of the similarities in how the game looks from My Friendly Neighborhood are astounding. And it feels like they're straying away from the core thing that makes a Five Nights at Freddy's game a Five Nights at Freddy's game. At least in Security Breach. Despite there not being a lot of, office, defend the office type deal. There was some of it, but not a lot. I don't think that's necessarily the core thing that makes up a Five Nights at Freddy's game. Something that makes a Five Nights at Freddy's game a Five Nights at Freddy's game is being able to look around and go, yeah, this is Five Nights at Freddy's. In Security Breach, Freddy's face was literally plastered on everything. Cups, flipping plants, dishes, everything. Everything was covered in Freddy's face. To have that kind of just taken away in this, and foreign characters you've never seen before on every wall, it doesn't feel like a Five Nights at Freddy's game. It feels like something else. Even Ruin felt like a Five Nights at Freddy's game. And I'm not saying we need to go back to the old Defend the Office type style of games, because I think that would get boring very fast if Scott Cawthon kept making those. But we at least need to see Freddy's face in some places. Like the only place in Secrets of the Mimic that feels even remotely like a Five Nights at Freddy's game is that one hidden basement section. But like, even still, that's just tucked away in a secret part of the game. All the rest of the game doesn't feel like that, and it all just feels foreign. I guess this brings us to how on earth can Steel Wool and Scott Cawthon fix this? What can they do to undo the problems that Secrets of the Mimic has created for not only the lore, but also the fandom? I'm sure you've seen the fandom get absolutely cut in half over this game. Pretty much, either you loved this game, or you hated this game. There's pretty much no in between. And the Five Nights at Freddy's community has been split in half over this. And it's genuinely disturbing to see. So how do they fix this? How do they stop from going away from Five Nights at Freddy's? How do they keep themselves from doing that? Well, the answer is surprisingly simple. Steel Wool, Scott Cawthon, if you're watching, you're probably not, but you know what? I can at least have my voice do something. Is you can have Secrets of the Mimic and all of that to do with the Mimic be a spin-off. The main canon can focus on Gregory, Cassie, and Vanessa, and the spin-off can focus on the Mimic. Kind of like Marvel's What If. You know, focusing on characters that aren't in the main canon, and some, you know, interesting stuff that would ruin the lore otherwise, but can be its own thing. And maybe you can invest maybe less time and effort into the Mimic games, have them be smaller, cheaper, with 6 or 7 hour experiences that aren't super big and don't require too much time and effort to pad the releases between main canon games. So that you can have, let's say you got Help Wanted 2, and then you got in the next game, I don't know, Fredbear's Pizzeria or whatever, a Mimic game in the middle, and then after Fredbear's Pizzeria, you have Fredbear's Pizzeria 2 Resurgence. But in between them, you can have Secrets of the Mimic, I don't know, Tales of the Tales, you know? You can have these smaller releases, pad the release between the bigger games, still appeal to the fandom, and keep the lore and everything intact, because it's a spin-off. It doesn't have to do with the main canon. It's so easy, and guess what? It can be implemented right now. All you have to do is say that Secrets of the Mimic was a brazen introduction into the spin-off series of Mimic. And then voila, all the problems are fixed. The retcons are gone, the lore is sound, the games can continue as promised. However, I understand how these things go, and this probably is not going to happen. To which I bid the FNAF lore goodbye. I mean, we've had some pretty nasty stuff happen to it over the years, but this is by far the worst thing. Because not only does it make the books canon, it also retcons them, and so it's just a huge mess of things that is happening, and it's just awful. Now, I guess to tally up the score, I would say, as far as graphics are concerned, Security Breach is better. As far as sound design, we'll say Mimic's better. Story, definitely Security Breach better. Characters, I can't ignore the retcons. Security Breach, better again. That's Security Breach 3, Mimic 1. And then finally, gameplay. Again, doesn't feel like a Five Nights at Freddy's game. So therefore, bam, gameplay goes to Security Breach. So there we go, ladies and gentlemen. Security Breach is officially better than Secrets of the Mimic. And one more thing I want to say about the gameplay of Secrets of the Mimic is that, yes, to make a game, you need good gameplay above all else. But here's the thing. When you have a franchise going, let me use an example, right? Say you're a singer and you sing jazz. You have smooth jazz music that you sing and you perform. Now, let's say many years into your career, you're well established, you've got a good following. Let's say you wanted to change it up a bit. Instead of doing jazz, let's try making, I don't know, pop instead. And so when you go and you make your pop songs and your pop music instead of your smooth jazz you had before, a lot of your current base is going to leave you. Your current fan base came for your jazz music, not your pop music. Some of your fans, your die-hard fans, are going to stay, and you're probably going to get new fans elsewhere, but that's going to take time. And a lot of your old fans are going to leave you, and that's going to be sad for them because they lost their favorite jazz artist. Same thing goes for the Five Nights at Freddy's games. If you start changing the games, making it into these puzzle-centric games that look and feel very different from what we've come to know as Five Nights at Freddy's games, you're going to end up with a lot of your FNAF community who came for FNAF stuff leaving. And maybe you'll find a new audience somewhere and you'll keep making money and you'll keep making games, but a lot of your old audience that got you to where you are now are going to leave. And that's sad. Maybe not for you, but for them it is. And I really don't want to see that happen. So although the gameplay in the Mimic is technically better, Security Breach at least feels like a Five Nights at Freddy's game. So it gets the final point, meaning that by a great margin, Security Breach is better than Secrets of the Mimic. And with that, I end this video. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, so much for watching. If you agreed or disagree with me, whatever, post your thoughts in the comments below. Pretty much FNAF now has become abstract art, so anyone's opinions, I guess they don't really mean anything because they can just retcon whatever they want. So the lore is whatever you believe it to be. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching again. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you in whatever I create next. So long.